My mother-in-law told me, on the first night I stayed in her house, that her son deserved better than me. She said it in the kitchen, while I was washing the dinner dishes, in the low certain tone of a woman who has made a decision and is informing you of it rather than discussing it. She said it without looking at me. She was wiping down the counter on the other side of the kitchen, and she said it the way you say something you have been thinking for a while and have finally decided to say out loud. She said, "Thomas deserves a woman who knows how to be a wife." I'm not sure you're that woman. I was 27 years old. I had been dating her son for 14 months. I was holding a dish I had just washed and the water was still running, and I stood there for a moment in the particular suspension of someone who has just heard something they were not prepared for and whose body has not yet decided what to do about it. I turned off the water. I set the dish down carefully on the drying rack. I said, "I appreciate you being honest with me." And then I went upstairs. That was the beginning. Let me take you back further, because the beginning of what I want to tell you actually starts before that kitchen, before Thomas, before the 14 months. It starts with who I was when I walked into that house, and what I understood about myself then, and what I understand now that I did not understand then. My name is Rachel. I am 36 years old. I live in a house in Portland, Oregon, that I own, that I chose, that I painted the front door of in a color called maritime blue that my former mother-in-law would have described as ostentatious and that I think is exactly right. I have a job I am good at, running the operations of a mid-sized nonprofit that works in affordable housing development. I have friends who know my whole story. I have a garden that is impractical and beautiful and entirely mine. I was not always this person. Or rather, I was always this person, but for 4 years I forgot it. This is the story of the forgetting and the remembering. I met Thomas at a work conference in Seattle. He was 30, I was 26, we were both there for reasons tangential to our actual work, and we ended up at the same panel discussion about sustainable urban development, and afterward he asked if I wanted to get a drink and I said yes. Thomas was good-looking in a reliable way, the kind of face that does not surprise you but that you are glad to keep looking at. He was funny in conversation, which matters more to me than most things. He worked in commercial real estate, which is not a field I find inherently interesting but which he described with enough specificity and self-awareness to make it interesting. He called me 2 days after the conference, which I noted as a good sign. We dated long distance for 6 months. He was in San Francisco, I was in Portland, before he relocated for a position that, he said, he had been considering for a while and which happened to be in Portland. I believed this. I still believe it was true. Thomas was not a dishonest man. He was a man who had been raised by a woman who made decisions for him and who had, without fully understanding it, organized his life around managing the distance between what she wanted and what he wanted. I did not know that yet. The first time I met his mother, Elena, was at a Sunday lunch at her house in the suburbs of San Francisco, 5 months into our relationship. Thomas had told me she was particular. He had used the word particular in the way that people use words that are standing in for different words. She was 63 years old, compact and precise in the way of women who have spent a long time managing their presentation. She wore her silver hair in a style that required effort. She had the kind of living room where things were arranged to communicate something, where every object was placed with intention, where a guest understood quickly that this was a house with rules about itself. She shook my hand at the door. Her handshake was the assessing kind. She looked at me with eyes that completed their inventory before the handshake was finished. She served lunch she had cooked herself, which was good. She was an excellent cook, one of her genuine qualities, and she asked me questions that were shaped like conversation and functioned like interviews. Where did I go to school? What did my parents do? How did I see my career developing? She asked these questions with the warm, interested manner of a woman who wanted to know me and the underlying efficiency of a woman who was determining whether I met specifications. Thomas watched this from across the table. He passed things and refilled glasses and laughed at moments that might have been awkward and generally performed the role of person who was smoothing something without acknowledging that anything needed smoothing. I answered her questions. I was good at interviews, having had enough of them professionally to know how to be clear and specific without being either defensive or ingratiating. I think this surprised her. She had expected, I later understood, someone less settled in herself, someone whose answers she could find gaps in. She did not find gaps. But she looked. Lunch ended. Thomas walked me to my rental car. He said, in the careful way he used when something was the opposite of casual, "She liked you." I said, "Did she?" He said, "She asked you real questions." She doesn't ask everyone real questions. I thought about the questions. I thought about what they had been assessing. I said, "Good." I drove to the airport thinking about the particular quality of attention Elena had given me during that lunch. It was thorough and it was skilled and it was almost entirely about identifying whether I was sufficient. Not whether I was interesting, not whether Thomas and I were good together, not whether I seemed like someone who would make her son happy. Whether I was sufficient for a standard she held and had not shared. I flew home. Thomas called that evening. He said his mother had said I seemed smart. I noted that smart was not the same as welcomed. I did not say this to Thomas. This was, I now understand, the first of many things I did not say to Thomas. We got engaged 14 months after the conference. He proposed on a Saturday morning in my apartment, in the specific way of a man who has thought about it carefully, the ring, the timing, the words. He got down on one knee by my kitchen window where the morning light came through and he said things he meant and I said yes, which I also meant. I called my parents. They were glad in the direct, uncomplicated way of people who trusted my judgment and wanted me to be happy and understood that those two things were related. Thomas called his mother. I could hear, from across the room, that the call was longer than a congratulations call needed to be. We were married 11 months later. Elena hosted the engagement dinner, which she organized with complete efficiency and a guest list that was weighted heavily toward her own connections, and which she described as a celebration and which functioned as an introduction of her son's fiancé to her social world, an introduction in which I was a figure to be assessed by people whose assessments she would later hear about and factor into her understanding of whether I was adequate. I wore a dress I loved. I talked to everyone. I was, by all outward measures, a success at an event designed to test me. Elena told Thomas afterward that her friends had found me charming, which she said in a tone that communicated she was not sure charm was the relevant quality. The wedding was in Portland. I planned it myself, with my mother's help, which is the way I had always assumed I would plan a wedding, with the people who knew me rather than the people who were evaluating me. Elena attended and sat in the front row and wore a hat that was the precise color of the bridesmaids' dresses, which may have been coincidence and which I did not ask about. The first year of marriage was good in the way that first years often are when two people are genuinely trying and have not yet encountered the specific pressures that reveal the architecture of what they have built. Thomas and I were compatible in most of the ways that matter daily. We talked about things, we managed disagreements without major damage. We built the rhythms of a shared life that felt, in most hours, like something real. Elena called Thomas 3 times a week. I noted the frequency without commenting on it. The calls were always when I was in the other room, which I understood was partly courtesy and partly something else, and I filed the something else away in the place I was keeping such things. She visited twice that first year. Each visit was 1 week. She stayed in the guest room that was 3 doors from our bedroom and she organized herself into our house with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew how to occupy space without appearing to take it over, which is a skill more aggressive than it sounds. She had opinions about the kitchen arrangement, delivered as observations. She had opinions about Thomas's diet, delivered as concern. She had opinions about my housekeeping, delivered as helpful suggestions. I listened to all of these with the patience I had developed over 14 months of understanding that direct response to Elena's indirect communications was not productive. Thomas did not intervene in any of this. He was, during his mother's visits, the man I recognized from the Sunday lunch in San Francisco, the person who passed things and refilled glasses and smoothed surfaces and did not acknowledge that there were surfaces that needed smoothing. At the end of her first visit, standing in the driveway while Thomas loaded her bag into the car, Elena said to me, "You're doing well, Rachel. I can see you're trying. I heard, you are being assessed on effort and the results are not yet conclusive." I said, "Thank you, Elena." The second year was when the architecture started to show. Thomas and I had our first real argument about his mother in October of year 2. Not our first argument, we had had arguments, functional ones, the kind that got resolved, but our first argument about Elena, which had a different quality because it was not really about what we were saying it was about. It started with a vacation. Thomas's family had a tradition of a summer trip, Elena, Thomas, his older brother David and David's wife and children, to a lake house Elena had rented every August for 15 years. Thomas wanted to go. I had no objection to going. What I objected to was how the trip had been organized. Elena had called Thomas to confirm dates and Thomas had confirmed them and then told me, in the same way he might tell me about a dentist appointment, informatively, after the fact. I said, I would have liked to be part of that decision. He said, it's the same dates every year. It wasn't really a decision. I said, we have 2 incomes and a shared calendar. When we make plans that affect both of us, we make them together. He said, it's just a vacation, Rachel. I said, it's not about the vacation. He said, then what is it about? It was about the pattern of which decisions were made with me and which were made around me, and how that pattern had been established over 2 years and was becoming the shape of our marriage. But I did not say it that precisely, because I did not yet have that precise an understanding of it. What I said was messier and less articulate, and the argument that followed was longer than it needed to be and resolved less than it should have. We went to the lake house. Elena organized the week with her usual thoroughness. She assigned rooms, planned meals, managed the social rhythm of 7 people in a house for 7 days. She was good at this, genuinely good. The organizational competence was real, and being managed by someone competent has a particular quality of being almost impossible to object to because every objection sounds ungrateful. On the 4th day, Elena and I were alone in the kitchen after breakfast while the others were at the dock. This happened by design on her part, I understood in retrospect, though I did not understand it in the moment. She was refilling the coffee. I was reading something on my phone. She said, without preamble, still facing the coffee maker, Thomas was engaged before you. Did he tell you? I looked up. I said he had mentioned it. She said, her name was Caroline. She was lovely. She turned around then, with her coffee, and looked at me with the assessing look. She knew how to be part of this family. I said, what does that mean? She said, it means she understood what Thomas needed. Where he came from. What matters to us. I said, and you don't think I understand those things? She said, I think you're still learning. She said it gently. She smiled when she said it. She carried her coffee to the table and said she thought the weather would hold for another day or 2 and did I want to go for a walk later. I sat with my phone and thought about Caroline, who was lovely, who knew how to be part of this family, who Thomas had been engaged to and had not married, and I thought about what it meant that Elena had said this to me in her kitchen while Thomas was at the dock, and what she expected me to do with the information, and what I was actually going to do with it. What I was going to do with it was file it. I was, by that point in year 2, building a very comprehensive file. I talked to my friend Nora when we got back from the lake house. Nora and I had been friends since college. She had met Elena once, at our wedding, and had formed an impression she had shared with me carefully because she knew I was still deciding how to think about things. Nora listened to the kitchen conversation and the Caroline information and the 2 years of accumulation that I gave her in the condensed, organized way of someone who has been thinking about something for a long time. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, Rachel. What does Thomas say about all of this? I said, I haven't told him most of it. She said, why? I thought about it. I said, because when I have brought things up, he explains them. He finds a reasonable interpretation. He says his mother doesn't mean it the way it lands. And I end up feeling like I'm the one making it complicated. Nora said, that's not nothing. I said, I know. She said, does Thomas know his mother said that to you in the kitchen? I said, no. She said, tell him. I told Thomas about the kitchen conversation that night. I told him everything Elena had said and how she had said it and what I had understood her to mean. I told him as specifically as I could, without the anger that was present, but that I did not want to be the reason he stopped hearing me. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, she shouldn't have said that. I said, no. He said, I'll talk to her. I said, Thomas, I need to know something. When your mother says things like that, and this isn't the first time, I've been not telling you things for 2 years because I didn't want to make it complicated, but this isn't the first time, what do you actually think? He looked at me. He said, I think she's difficult. I said, and? He said, and I love her. And I know she's difficult. And I've been managing that my whole life and I'm tired of it, but I don't know how to stop. That was the most honest thing Thomas said to me in 4 years of marriage. It was also, I understood listening to it, the problem. He was tired. He had been managing Elena his whole life and he was tired, and managing her required energy he was not directing toward us. And I had been accommodating the management, not questioning, not insisting, filing things in the place I kept them, because I had understood that confrontation was not productive and had not yet understood that a different kind of conversation was possible. Thomas talked to Elena. Whatever he said, something shifted, not dramatically, not permanently, but enough that the following months were different in their texture. She did not stop calling 3 times a week. She did not stop having opinions. But she was more careful, for a while, about which ones she delivered directly to me. Year 3 was better. I am being accurate about this because I do not want to tell the story as a clean arc toward a predetermined ending. Year 3 was genuinely better. Thomas and I talked more, really talked, the way we had talked in those first months in Seattle before the weight of his family had settled on us. We made decisions together, including a weekend trip to the Oregon coast where I planned everything and he followed without managing, and it was, for 3 days, exactly what I had thought we were building toward. I thought, we are going to be okay. I thought it clearly enough to say it to Nora, who raised an eyebrow in the specific way she has when she is being careful about what she says back. She said, I hope so. Year 4 was when Elena was diagnosed. Ovarian cancer, stage 2, caught at the kind of appointment that women are told to keep and that Elena had been keeping because she was, whatever else she was, a meticulous person about things within her control. The prognosis was serious but not without hope. Treatment was aggressive, surgery, chemotherapy, the months-long process of fighting something real. Thomas flew to San Francisco the week of her diagnosis. He stayed for 2 weeks. He came back and went back 3 times over the following 6 months, which was the right thing to do and which I supported without qualification. His mother was sick. He needed to be there. There was no version of this in which I was anything other than supportive. What I was not prepared for was what happened to our marriage during those 6 months. Thomas came home from San Francisco different each time. Not worse, not better, different in the way of someone who has been spending sustained time inside a grief that is not yet complete, who has been in the presence of something large and uncertain, and who comes home to the ordinary and finds that the ordinary does not quite hold him anymore. He was distracted in ways I understood and also in ways that had nothing to do with his mother's illness. Elena called more, not less, during her treatment. This was understandable. She was frightened and Thomas was the person she called when she was frightened. But the calls went from 3 times a week to sometimes twice in a day, and Thomas took them wherever he was, including during dinners, including during conversations, including once in the middle of a disagreement we were having about something unrelated and important that never got resolved because Elena called and Thomas answered and the disagreement was still unresolved the next morning. I said, "Can we talk about last night?" He said, "My mother is having chemotherapy, Rachel." I said, "I know. And I'm not asking you to not take her calls. I'm asking you to finish a conversation with me before you take one." He said, "You want to schedule when I talk to my mother while she has cancer." That is not what I said. That is not what I meant. But it is the version that stuck. I stopped bringing things up. This was different from before. Before, I had been filing things, keeping them, knowing I would address them when the time was right. Now I was just stopping. Not filing. Stopping. The difference was significant and I did not understand it fully until later. Elena completed her treatment. The cancer went into remission. She recovered with the same meticulous efficiency she applied to everything. By the time year 4 ended she was, by all medical measures, well. Our marriage was not well. I had spent 6 months not bringing things up, and the things I had not brought up had accumulated in a different way than filing. They had become a silence that had its own texture, its own weight. Thomas and I moved through our days with the functional ease of people who have learned to coexist without requiring much from each other, which looked like peace and was not peace. Nora said to me, at dinner in November of year 4, "What do you want, Rachel?" I said, "I want my marriage to work." She said, "And what would that look like?" I sat with that for a long time. I said, "Like someone actually asking." She said, "Has Thomas asked?" I said, "Not in a while." She said, "Have you told him you needed him to ask?" I said no. She said, "Rachel, you've spent 4 years not saying things." She was right. I had spent 4 years filing and accommodating and being patient with the difficult and not saying the things that needed saying, and the things had accumulated until the silence around them was its own kind of answer. I told Thomas the first wanted to go to couples therapy. He was quiet when I said it. Not resistant, just quiet, in the way of someone who is hearing something they were not ready for but who recognizes, on some level, that it is true. He said, "You think we need that?" I said, "I think we've been not talking about things for 4 years and I don't know how to start talking about them without someone helping us." He said, "Is this about my mother?" I said, "It's about us. Your mother is part of it." He said, "Okay." We went. The therapist's name was Dr. Park, a calm unhurried man who had a way of asking questions that removed the defensive posture from them. We went for 6 months. In those 6 months, with Dr. Park in the room, Thomas and I said things to each other we had not said in 4 years. Thomas said he had spent his whole life managing his mother and he had brought that management into our marriage without realizing it and he was sorry. He said it looking at me, not at Dr. Park. He said he had been treating me like someone who needed to be accommodated rather than someone he was building a life with. I said I had been filing things instead of saying them and that had been its own kind of avoidance and I was sorry for the part of me that had colluded with the silence. Dr. Park let these things be said and then asked what we were going to do differently. We tried. I want to say clearly that we tried, both of us, in the months that followed. Thomas drew a boundary with Elena that was real and specific, about the calls, about the decisions made without me, about the specific things Elena said to me when Thomas was not in the room. Elena received this boundary with the particular displeasure of someone who did not expect to have it drawn and did not accept it without effort. She called me directly once, after Thomas had spoken to her. She was not unpleasant. She was, in fact, remarkably controlled. She said she hoped we could move forward productively. She said she only wanted what was best for Thomas. She said she hoped I understood that. I said I hoped she did too. And then she said, "I know Thomas loves you. I just want to make sure you know what you're asking him to give up." I said, "He's not giving up anything. He's building something." She said, "I hope you're right." She hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand and I thought about 4 years of this particular kind of conversation, the one that sounded almost like something else, that always had a shape underneath the words, that always left me holding something I was not sure how to put down. Thomas and I did not make it. I want to tell you that plainly, without building toward it or softening it, because it deserves to be said directly. We tried and we did not make it. Not because of Elena, not entirely, she was part of it, but the marriage had other fractures by the time we understood what it needed, and some of those fractures were structural in ways that therapy helped us see but could not repair. We separated in the spring of our 5th year. The separation was calm in the way that something can be calm when it has been a long time coming and both people know it and have made their peace with knowing. We were not cruel to each other. We divided things fairly, with lawyers who were professional and uninterested in prolonging anything. Thomas moved out in April. The house became mine, which was in the settlement and which I had chosen to keep because I had chosen the house and the neighborhood and I was not going to give them up because the marriage had not worked. I repainted the front door that summer. I chose maritime blue. The man at the paint store said it was a bold choice. I said yes. I called Nora when I had finished. She came over with wine and we sat on the front steps and looked at the door and she said, "It's very you." I said, "That's the point." Thomas and I have not spoken since the finalization of the divorce, which was 8 months ago. I do not have feelings about this that are simple. He was a good man in most of the ways that count and an incomplete man in the specific way that mattered most to us, and both of those things are true and I hold both of them. Elena sent me a note after the divorce was finalized. A paper note, 3 sentences, in her precise handwriting. She said she was sorry it had not worked out. She said she hoped I would be well. She said Thomas was fortunate to have had me in his life. 3 sentences. After 5 years. I read them 3 times. I did not write back. There was nothing to write that would have been the right amount of anything. I am 36 years old. I work for a non-profit that builds affordable housing, which is work I believe in and am good at. I have Nora, and the friends I have kept and grown over the years of all of this. I have my house with the maritime blue door and a garden that is impractical and a kitchen where no one tells me how to arrange things. I was not the woman Elena thought her son deserved. I was always exactly the woman I was. It took me 5 years and a divorce and a can of maritime blue paint to stop having to remind myself of that. I do not need to remind myself anymore. I know.